Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a topic that absolutely dominates headlines, but, let's be honest, is rarely discussed without a whole lot of shouting. We're talking about Alberta separatism. We are totally stripping away the politics today and just looking at the raw data and the history. To do this, we're using Dr. Michael Wagner's very comprehensive book, Alberta Separatism, Then and Now, as our guide. It gives us a really dense, strictly evidence-based walkthrough of exactly how Alberta's relationship with the rest of Canada got to where it is today.
So let me ask you, why does the idea of an independent Alberta just keep resurfacing? It's super easy to scroll through your newsfeed and assume this is just some sudden whim, right? Or maybe just a knee-jerk reaction to whoever happens to be sitting in Ottawa right now. But Wagner's book reveals something much deeper. He frames this not as a new trend, but as a long, escalating, 100-year-old pressure cooker that has been building for over a century.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our 6-part roadmap to trace this pressure cooker. We'll cover 1. Born into inequality. 2. The National Energy Program. 3. The West wants in. 4. The firewall letter strategy. 5. The modern resurgence. And finally 6. The logistics of independence.
All right, starting at the foundation with Section 1, Born into Inequality. To really understand the present, Wagner argues that we actually have to go way back to 1905 to what he calls the original sin of Alberta's creation. See, while the original 4 provinces of Confederation were granted full control of their natural resources from literally day one, Alberta entered as what was called a junior province. The federal government basically kept control of their resources, quoting here, for the purposes of the Dominion. Just imagine starting a brand new partnership where you are immediately treated kind of like a second-class colony. That right there is the very root of the grievance.
And you know, this early frustration didn't just fade away over time, it actually morphed. By the time the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, this feeling of inequality had transformed into a really distinct political identity. Premier William Aberhart and his Social Credit Party didn't just sit around and complain, they took action. They actually tried to issue their own local currency called prosperity certificates. It was this radical, absolutely desperate economic experiment to try and shield Albertans from the devastation of the era.
But here is where the structural reality of Canada really set in. Ottawa and the courts stepped in and completely struck down Alberta's banking laws through a process called federal disallowance. Wagner points out that this proves something really fundamental to the Alberta political psyche. Even when Albertans voted overwhelmingly for a radical, localized change, the federal constitutional structure was explicitly designed to block it. Moving on to Section 2, the National Energy Program.
Now, what's really interesting here is how the tone shifts dramatically when we jump to the 1980s. Enter the NEP, introduced by Pierre Trudeau. This federal policy effectively forced Alberta to sell its oil to central Canada at heavily discounted, below-market prices. But at the exact same time, Albertans were still required to pay the much higher world prices for any imports they needed. This wasn't just a simple policy tweak, it was a staggering, massive wealth transfer. Wagner refers to this devastating era as Black September.
And the economic shock of this was swift and just brutal. To put that into perspective, before 1980, things were at a totally baseline normal. But afterward, capital didn't just leave. It literally hemorrhaged out of the province. Bankruptcies hit an incredibly historic, crippling spike. We're talking about businesses collapsing and homes being lost. It created an absolutely unprecedented economic shock. Now, you might think separatism is just a modern internet phenomenon, right? But actually, scratch that. This economic shock birthed a real separatist victory decades ago. In 1982, the Western Canada Concept Party shocked the entire nation by electing Gordon Kessler. He was the first separatist member of the Legislative Assembly in Alberta's history. Separation became a household word. The anger had officially found its way to the ballot box.
Let's look at Section 3, the West wants in.
By 1987, the strategy experienced what Wagner describes as the Great Redirection. The movement completely pivoted away from leaving the country. This new era was perfectly captured by Preston Manning's very famous vision, "The West wants in." Manning, leading the Reform Party, wanted to convince Albertans that the best way forward was actually to fix Canada from the inside out. They didn't want to leave the table anymore, they just wanted a fair seat at it.
And the proposed mechanism to fix the system was the Triple E Senate, meaning equal, elected, and effective. The idea was to have a Senate with equal representation for all provinces, regardless of their population, filled with members elected by the people rather than appointed, and effective enough to actually put a check on the power of the House of Commons. It was specifically designed to be a structural defense for Alberta against the massive voting power of central Canada.
So what happened to this grand plan? Well, the quest for the Triple E Senate hit a massive geographic wall. Because the reform movement just couldn't win enough seats in Ontario to actually form a government, it was eventually forced into a political merger with the traditional progressive Conservatives. Wagner argues that for many Albertans, this felt like a really bitter defeat. Their specific, highly localized interests felt like they were once again being diluted just to appease Eastern voters.
Which brings us to Section 4, the firewall letter strategy.
We're in the year 2001 now. Having failed to reform the system from the inside, the strategy shifted yet again toward demanding maximum provincial autonomy. A very famous open letter was addressed to Premier Ralph Klein laying out 5 key demands. They wanted to withdraw from the CPP, replace the RCMP with a provincial force, collect their own provincial income tax, take full control of healthcare, and completely end the Equalization program. See, they weren't explicitly asking to leave Canada here. They were building a firewall against Ottawa. And Wagner identifies this exact 2001 letter as the direct, undeniable blueprint for the modern Sovereignty Act.
Let's jump to Section 5, the modern separatist resurgence.
Let's move to the present day and see how this all builds up. If the firewall letter was the theory, the last decade provided the absolute perfect storm. Just look at this timeline. It starts with the dual election shock of 2015, bringing the provincial NDP and federal Liberals to power. Then, from 2016 to 2018, you have consecutive pipeline vetoes by Central Canada and British Columbia. This isolation rapidly escalated, leading to Wexit rallies catching fire and going viral on social media, which eventually culminated in the 2022 birthing of the Wild Rose Independence Party. Separatist sentiment came roaring right back into the mainstream.
Finally, Section 6, the logistics of independence.
Rhetoric and rallies are one thing, but Wagner really shifts gears in his final chapters to explore the cold, hard, logistical realities of secession. The very first massive constitutional hurdle, the Clarity Act. If Alberta wanted to leave, this federal law requires a clear majority on a clear question in a referendum. But here's the catch. Who gets to define what clear actually means? The federal parliament does. It is an incredibly high legal bar designed specifically to make legally leaving Confederation extremely difficult.
Then there is the deeply complex Indigenous factor. And this is a really crucial point that gets overlooked a lot. The historical treaties were signed with the British Crown and inherited by Ottawa, not by Alberta. Wagner impartially points out that without the explicit consent of Indigenous nations, the very land base of an independent Alberta would be highly contested under both domestic and international law.
And physically speaking, there is the undeniable geographic reality. A brand new independent Alberta would be completely landlocked. So how do you export your oil if you're suddenly surrounded by foreign countries? Well, Wagner notes that while it would be extremely difficult, Alberta could theoretically still export its resources by relying on international right of access laws and treaties that are designed specifically for landlocked states. Think of how countries like Switzerland or Austria operate today.
So what does this all mean for the future? We are left with Wagner's final, provocative dilemma. Is the modern sovereignty movement just a high-stakes threat being used for leverage to get a better deal out of Ottawa? Or, if the federal system structurally favors the East and remains completely unchanged, will this 100-year historical cycle eventually reach a breaking point where exit becomes the only logical step left?